Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the president of Founding Forward. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Jack Templeton Liberty Series. As I think most of you know now, the Founding Forward is the result of a merger between two wonderful and effective charities, the Union League Legacy Foundation and Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge. And we are dedicated to preserving our union, just like the Union League was in 1862. And we do that through education, through educating students, teachers, and others on the very basic values and principles of our great nation, because we believe there's a crisis in civics education and in an understanding of that. And so we are here to make a difference, to do that nationally. We look forward to sharing more of our plans with you in the coming months. We're going to need your support to make a difference, and I look forward to that support. We hope that every league member will support the great work of Founding Forward. So a few announcements. First of all, as always, if you would just take a moment to silence your cell phones, or better yet, turn them off. Our program tonight will include a question and answer period, and the questions will be taken on the cards. You should all have a card or two on your seat. Staff will come around and pick them up. We will get to as many of them as we possibly can. We are going to take, I think, a little break on speaker programs, as we have a number of things coming up the next couple of weeks. And we're going to start again up in Liberty Hill, in Lafayette Hill. On June 13th, we have a program, Rome and the Constitution, and it's being presented by Joe Fornieri. Joe is actually doing a program that week for 50 teachers who coming from across the country on Rome and the Constitution at Liberty Hill, and we're going to do that for 5 consecutive weeks. I think or maybe there's a break there for 4th of July, but 5 programs at Liberty Hill with professors who are teaching these teachers on the same subject. So check the Union League website. If you're a Union League member, go to Founding Forward website. We look forward to seeing you on June 13th. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of our Education Committee, the chair of our Strategic Planning Committee, a member of our Executive Committee of the Founding Forward Board, one of the great leaders of Founding Forward and of the Union League, to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Steve Target. Steve.
Thank you, John. Well, good evening, everybody. Tonight's speaker, Greg Lukianoff, is one of the nation's premier First Amendment advocates. He's an attorney, a New York Times best-selling author, and president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, also known as FIRE. He co-authored The Coddling of the American Mind, and tonight Greg will address the topic of his most recent book, The Canceling of the American Mind. Greg's also an executive producer of Can We Take a Joke?, a feature-length documentary that explores the collision between comedy, censorship, and outrage culture, both on and off campuses. And of Mighty Ira, a civil liberties story, an award-winning feature-length film about the life and career of former ACLU executive director Ira Glasser. Greg has been published in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and numerous other publications. He frequently appears in TV shows and radio programs, including CBS Evening News, The Today Show, NPR's Morning Edition, as well as podcasts like Fire's So to Speak. He's testified both before the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives about free speech issues on today's America's college campuses. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Greg.
I'm not sure I'm going to have a lot to talk about. Free speech, particularly on campus, hasn't been much in the news lately. Honestly, whoa, what on earth is that? We've been a little, do you know how to fix this thing? Okay. Honestly, at FIRE, we have been, starting with email threads at 6 o'clock in the morning and stopping at 2 o'clock in the morning, going through all the craziness that's going on campuses lately. The only good news that I can say that come out of campuses since October 7th is like what Bill Maher said when I had the honor of doing a show back in December, is only complete ideologues. They're the only ones left saying there's not a serious problem in higher ed today. So I wrote a book called Canceling of the American Mind, and I wrote it with a brilliant 23-year-old named Ricky Schlott. And it was really to try to address, we were originally going to do something that was a follow-up to Coddling the American Mind that was much more directly a follow-up to Coddling the American Mind. But I couldn't believe that I was still dealing with people who were trying to tell me that cancel culture wasn't real, that it was a hoax. They were already trying to, hey, Laura, a much beloved former fire employee, sorry, that was very excited for me. We're a tight group. Anyway. That I couldn't believe people were still trying to claim that cancel culture wasn't real. So FIRE has an amazing research department. We decided to put together the data showing that not only it's real, it's on a historic scale. And the book became Canceling the American Mind. It had the misfortune of coming out on October 17th, so it was a little bit overshadowed by what was going on in the Middle East. And it was right before people understood that everything we're talking about in the book was very relevant to what you would later be seeing, the madness you would see on campus. So what's our definition of cancel culture? Ours is pretty straightforward historical definition. We're trying to present it as, we want cancel culture, the age of cancel culture, to be kind of the same way that people talk about the age of the Red Scares or McCarthyism or other moments of mass censorship in history. And we define it as the uptick of campaigns to get people fired, expelled, deplatformed, etc., for speech that would be protected under First Amendment law. When we explain a little bit in greater detail, we're making an analogy to public employee law, to work in a tremendous amount of nuance and common sense in the definition, and the culture of fear that resulted from it. And this partially came from, I've been at FIRE. FIRE turns 25 this year, and I've been at FIRE for 23 of those years. We went from being a $500,000 organization to being a $36 million organization. And I couldn't be prouder of the work that we do there. And it wasn't subtle in 2014. Something changed. Students were great on free speech, and suddenly they were terrible on free speech. And they were joining with the administrators who were already terrible on free speech to launch campaigns to get professors fired and students canceled. And it was really bad in 2014, it accelerated in 2017, and it went completely off the rails 2020 and afterwards. So things have gotten so bad that this was something that I used to do when I would talk to high schools about freedom of speech, and I now have to do this at colleges. I have to explain, okay, you guys have been taught something really stupid about freedom of speech. You have been taught that freedom of speech is the argument of the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. My favorite robber baron, of course, Tony Stark. And this is nonsense. This is something that you have to be in a very privileged, wealthy bubble to actually begin to believe. I've heard people on campuses, try to make the argument that free speech is the argument of the powerful. And I'm like, no, you're powerful. You represent a massive, we compare in the book the total income and assets of American higher education. We realize it's about the same as the GDP of Mexico. And they're not very comfortable with the idea that they're very powerful. But when you're in power, suddenly free speech seems more like a burden. If enlightened people who agree with you are going to be the ones deciding what people can say, then suddenly it doesn't seem quite so bad. And I have to explain that freedom of speech exists to protect minorities, literal minorities. And I just have to do some basic math here. In history, the robber baron, the wealthy, do pretty well because they're wealthy and powerful. I mean, a lot of the story of democracy is that kings, went to the wealthy class to ask for money from them, and we got some representation. That's kind of how a lot of it started. And when you start having democratic forms of government, if you have 50% of the vote, or +1, then the bully and the bigot get to decide. You literally only need the protections of freedom of speech to protect unpopular and minority points of view and points that are unpopular with the powerful. But partially because this campaign has been going on campus to turn, and it's been to some degree very intentional since as early as 1965 at Herbert Marcuse's repressive tolerance, to turn the tables on freedom of speech in the hopes that eventually, their guardian class ends up being in charge. And they're getting closer to it. And this is a chart to explain like how bad it's been for professor cancellations. The standard estimate of the number of professors who lost their jobs under McCarthyism from 1947, the 11 years from 1947 to 1957, is about 62 communist professors lost their jobs, and about 100 professors overall lost their jobs for opinions. Cancel culture is twice that number in terms of professors that we know of who are fired, and we know that's a wild undercount. So anytime someone tries to dismiss this as a problem, like, did you think McCarthyism was a problem? And guess what? That was before the law was clear that you couldn't fire professors for being communists. The law is really strong now, and there's nothing that parallels to what we're actually currently seeing on campus in terms of numbers. Over 1,000 professors targeted, overwhelmingly, by the way, by administrators and students, about 2/3 of them punished in some way, and almost 200 of them fired. Actually, it's more than 200 at this point. And this is how we know it's an undercount. 1 in 6 professors say that they've either been investigated for speech or actually punished for speech. That's like 100,000 professors extrapolated outwards. There is no historical comparison for that. Nothing comes even close. 1 in 3 professors say that they were pressured in order to avoid controversial topics. 1/3. There aren't numbers like this. To give you a sense of like what previous chilled moments in the history of freedom of speech were on campus, they did a survey of whether or not professors were self-censoring during McCarthyism. They got about 9% of professors said they were toning down what they were writing because they were afraid of the political ramifications. Guess what? 9% is terrible. That is 1 in 10 professors saying that they are self-censoring. We asked a similar question on a recent survey for faculty, one that was only about what you write in papers. About 35% of professors said that they were self-censoring. But when we asked if you were self-censoring, period, about 90% of professors said they were self-censoring. So this is one of the reasons why you can feel like you're banging your head against the wall trying to explain. You really are trying to claim that this thing is a hoax. Why are people claiming that cancel culture is a hoax? Because it's inconvenient for a narrative in which that basically this is just accountability culture. Now, one of the fun things about canceling the American mind, and I hope you'll buy it, and all the copies that I gave out tonight, I signed and put my email address in, because we're working on the paperback right now, and I want to keep updating it. I want to make sure it's as relevant as possible. But some of the most fun parts of it for me, nerd, is to actually talk about how people should start to understand cancel culture as just a way of winning arguments without actually winning arguments. A way to defeat your opponent, your ideological opponent, without actually refuting your ideological opponent. And so we need to understand as just another cheap tactic in order to skirt arguments. So we talk a lot about in the book what we call the perfect rhetorical fortress on the left. First, we go through, and I have a Substack called The Eternally Radical Idea. I wrote about what I call the minefield and the obstacle course, all the typical dodges that, frankly, people all over the spectrum use to avoid argument on, say, social media. But the perfect rhetorical fortress is the one that was built up on the left. And we call it perfect because it's just layer after layer of you can't defeat it because it basically is endless. And by the time you get through it, so let me explain what I mean. So the perfect rhetorical fortress starts with, is the speaker conservative? But here's the trick. They don't actually mean, are you the 36% of people who are conservative? I call this fascio-casting. It's magically casting a spell that someone is right-wing or a fascist, if you really hate them. That's what you call them. And then magically, you don't have to listen to them anymore. And FIRE is an organization that actually employs people all over the political spectrum. The interesting thing about the pushback against cancel culture in 2014 is, unlike the push against higher ed in the 80s, it was overwhelmingly led by center-left people who were saying this. But guess what? Magically, fascists don't have to listen to them anymore. So you can basically accuse everyone of being a fascist. So my favorite moment in the recent past was a screedy article by someone named Marianne Franks accusing the ACLU and the New York Times of, she wouldn't quite call them fascists, but they're definitely dupes for fascists. And this is like a well-respected professor. Then you get into all what we call the demographic funnel. What's the speaker's race? What's the speaker's sex? What's the speaker's sexuality? Is the speaker's trans or cis? Can the speaker be accused of phobia? Is the speaker guilty by association? Did the speaker lose their cool? That's a great one, because it's really hard not to lose your cool if you do this. Did the speaker violate a thought-terminating cliche? And then if all else fails, you have emotional blackmail, and my favorite one, which happens in a lot of cases, including the Nicholas Christakis case, well, if you've totally lost, darkly hint this was all about something else that you can't talk about. It happens over and over again. And so this is that demographic funnel part. We had some fun with this. When I talked to Jonathan Haidt about this, he was like, "Don't use actual numbers, Greg. Don't actually do the analysis." I'm like, "No, I'm doing the actual numbers on what this actually means, because people don't actually get the demographic breakdown in the United States. Like you ask Republicans and they think like 40% of the country is gay." And so we go through the demographic funnel here, and we get to 36% of the population is conservative, but of course 100% can be accused of it. You get to 76% is white, 50% of the population male, 90. So we start combining these, and you get down and down and down until you get to the most perfectly intersectional person who ever lived, and like a disabled minority transgender person. And you're talking about a tiny, tiny sliver of the population. But here's why you have to understand it as a rhetorical technique. Because guess what? Magically, you just got rid of 99.7% of the entire population of the country. You can dismiss them using all of these cheap tactics. But of course, this means that disabled transgender person of color, their opinion must be gold, right? Wrong. If they actually make the wrong argument, surprise! You are guilty of internalized transphobia, internalized racism, and internalized misogyny, and you get it even worse than anyone else. The funny thing is, my co-author, who I mentioned already, she is constantly being told that she has internalized misogyny. Why? Because it's easier than actually addressing her argument and realizing that this 23-year-old's smarter than you. Welcome to the and then we talk about the conformity gauntlet. Now, I think my best explanation of this is actually in Reason magazine. They took this excerpt and we updated it with even more upsetting data. We go through the exercise of what if you are a independent-minded high schooler who longs to be a famous scientist one day, and all the conformity-inducing pressures you will experience. And we talk a lot about DEI statements. We did an amazing survey on this as well. We found about half of professors think that DEI statements are political litmus tests, and the other half are wrong. 90% of conservatives believe so, because they are, and 56% of moderates believe so. We found that about 46% of large institutions had DEI statements as of a couple of years ago. I think it's more like 3/4. There was a good sign that MIT just said it's going to drop its DEI statements. That's progress. I'll kind of believe it when I see it. Well, usually the MO here is they just change what they call it. They might call them belonging statements. They're moving over to the word belonging, which sounds so nice, but it's a political litmus test. 23% of tenured, this is my favorite stat that we found. Okay, so I thought there'd only be two possibilities. You'd either think they're political litmus tests or think they were appropriate. I didn't realize that 23% of professors that we asked thought they were political litmus tests and appropriate. That's, for people who think everyone else is a fascist, that's pretty fascist. 76% of faculty applicants to UC Berkeley's life science department were eliminated solely on the basis of their diversity statements. Let that sink in. Scientists were eliminated by administrators because administrators did not like their political litmus test. And by the way, we did this awesome experiment at FIRE. Nate Honeycutt, who's one of our great researchers at FIRE, he did 5 different versions of DEI statements, and he got 3,600 professors to evaluate them to just prove that they're political litmus tests. He did one on a DEI statement talking about the value of religious diversity, another one on ideological viewpoint diversity, another one on socioeconomic diversity, which, by the way, is the thing that is most missing in elite colleges, and I feel very strongly about that. And then he did one that I would describe, and not a word I love, but as a woke statement that essentially was highly doctrinaire, basically all the right answers, anti-racism, Kendi, intersectionality, all that stuff. And guess what? None of the other ones would get you hired, including the socioeconomic one. The only one that would get you hired was the doctrinaire one. And this is, and of course, we're having a little bit of a hard time publishing this study because, perfect rhetorical fortress. And the conformity gauntlet. The thing we're going through here is that at every stage of the process now in higher ed, you have to do some kind of ideological statement that will be evaluated by people who are pretty hostile to dissenters. You have to get through high school without being canceled. You have to get through college without being a victim of the bias-related incident program. You have to, which most people don't even know about. You have to get through undergrad without being canceled and without internalizing censorship. So it just is layer after layer, and that's something that we really wanted to do, because since I've been doing this work for so long at FIRE, people really got to get it's not just one thing. It's layer after layer to crush your soul and get you to conform and embrace unwarranted ideological certainty. So these are just step after step. And one thing that I found particularly galling is that nature human behavior came out with a statement saying that they will they'll consider no longer publishing any study that could be found to be quote unquote harmful to groups. And think this through. You're a scientist. You've gotten through all of these hurdles. You've gotten through every single one and somehow magically survived. And the biggest journal in the country will not publish you because they just don't like your conclusions. The game is currently way, way rigged. And yeah, 1 in 10 college students, this is also from our research department, 1 in 10 college students say that they've either been punished for their speech or threatened that we'd be punished for their speech. That's like 1 million students across the country. Again, not any historical comparison. It was generally a big deal at the beginning of my career for a student to get in trouble for their speech. Now this is an industry. And this is also part of what we're up against. Depending on, in a list of departments, the faculty diversity ratio, viewpoint diversity ratio at Harvard is 88-1. And these are the people evaluating your diversity statements. These are the people who are grading you. And I was not sensitive to the idea that this was a major threat to the production of ideas and to academia itself when I first started at FIRE. But now because I thought the ratio was more like 3-1. 88-1 is disastrous. And just to put a little bit of meat on the bones, we have some truly, ridiculous cases. At Yale University, this is Trent Colbert. He used a slang word in an email, trap house, which is basically like a word that means, like a place where people go and drink. And he was suddenly being threatened by an administrator there, being told that, nice legal career you got there, wouldn't want that to be ruined. We'd have to talk to to the people who verify you as a lawyer. And they're literally threatening this guy's legal career unless he signed a pre-written apology by Yale administrators. We intervened, we got some publicity here, Trent's okay. But what's galling is that the administrators in this case, they're still at Yale. And this keeps happening. Now, this case I just find kind of funny. This is Kimberly Day. She is a pharmacist. She likes racy hip hop. And on her Instagram, she would sometimes talk about the lyrics of Cardi B. And she got suspended from her pharmacy program for that. And we were trying to figure out what on earth is this about? And they were making the argument that it was speech unbecoming of a pharmacist. And it's kind of like, can you imagine going to CVS and being like, I'd really need my amoxicillin lady, but Cardi B? So political discrimination. 49% of graduate students endorsed ousting a faculty member who expressed conservative view. And it's actually worse as you go into the data. Like basically when you hear about students objecting to offensive speech in class, when you dig into what they're actually saying, they mean politically incorrect opinions. So the students are policing this stuff like crazy. And that's one of the reasons why there was such an uptick in cancellations after 2017. It took that long for students to get the chutzpah to actually start signing these documents demanding that their professors get fired for speech. And this is my friend Carol Hooven. She got forced out at Harvard for arguing. She's an evolutionary biologist. She worked with chimpanzees. She collected urine out in Africa. She wrote this amazing book called Testosterone, which I highly recommend. And she went on TV and she explained, she went on Fox News to talk about her book. And she said, we should be compassionate towards trans people. We should be accommodating. We should use their pronouns. I always point out that, from a First Amendment standpoint, you don't have to use them, but you can argue that you can. You can or should. But we can't pretend that biological sex isn't a fact. And next thing you know, a faculty leader a graduate student who's the leader of the diversity task force at Harvard starts going after her pretty hard. And suddenly students won't work her class. Suddenly she's being put in people are unfriending her, like actual friends are disowning her. And only people like Steve Pinker came to her defense, who's on our advisory council. Steve is amazing. Harvard should have come out and said, this is insane. We're not going to force a professor out because she said something that up until 5 minutes ago everybody knew was true. And I point this out a lot, is that this is tragic for Carol. It was a very difficult time for her. She's an incredibly self-confident woman. And she felt, it was the first time she ever thought of suicide. Like it was that depressing for her. But I don't think Harvard understands quite a disaster this was for Harvard. And I don't think the expert class understands, and this is a major theme of canceling of the American mind. This destroys our universe of shared facts. How? How does it do that? It does it by the fact that people aren't actually stupid. And when they look up to Harvard and they find out that a professor got canceled just for saying biological sex is real, which it is, of course, she gets canceled for that? Guess what? They're never going to trust you again. They're never going to take you seriously if they know that they can actually make you fire you for saying true things. And this is one of the reasons why there's been such a plummet in appreciation for expert opinion, because they've earned that. And one of the reasons why there's been a plummet in appreciation for higher ed. And it's a real, genuine, forgive the term, epistemic disaster. And how many people know about Mike Adams? Oh, very few of you. Okay, so this one, when I started at FIRE it was right after 9/11. It was, and my first cases involved people who said insensitive things about 9/11. And in this case, Mike said something insensitive towards someone who said something insensitive about 9/11. He was at UNC Wilmington. And a student on September 11th or maybe September 12th came out and sent an all faculty, all staff email saying, America totally had this coming. This was totally our fault. We were imperialists, blah, 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 all that stuff. And Mike wrote back saying, listen, your speech is protected by the First Amendment, just like bigoted, ignorant speech always has been. And they launched an investigation of Mike. And I was pretty new to FIRE back then, and I thought this was an outrageous case. We'd later figure out this is about a 4 out of 10 in terms of intensity scale. But Mike and I kind of became friends, even though politically we couldn't be more different. And apparently I inspired him because I was reading a book called How to Talk Dirty and Influence People by Lenny Bruce. He read it and would thank me sometimes on radio, being like, well, my friend Greg Lukianoff had me read this book, and now I realize I have to be an in-your-face conservative. I'm like, oh, God. I created a monster. So he got in a lot of trouble because he had a very jokey style, but he was very irreverent, and he was always going after the left. And he actually won a huge victory for academic freedom in the entire Fourth Circuit by being brave enough. My friend David French represented him in this case. He had run some really serious victories for freedom of speech. And in the spring of 2020, he made a joke likening lockdowns to slavery. He talked about going to get beers with 6 of his friends in a state that didn't have lockdowns, and he said, "Massa governor, let my people go." It's a joke out of Ferris Bueller. And next thing you know, there was a mob to get Mike canceled, and they succeeded. And what we saw in 2020, particularly after the death of George Floyd, was the biggest uptick in cancellation attempts against professors in our history. We saw more cases in June of 2020 than we would sometimes see in entire years at FIRE. And he was forced out. He got a severance package, not a great one, and he was forced out. And I was overwhelmed with professors in trouble. And I thought Mike would be fine, because Mike always seemed like a hyper-confident person. He always seemed like someone who could weather anything, and I thought he would think this was all funny. So I didn't actually check in with Mike until mid-July of 2020. And apparently protesters were still coming to his house. They were threatening his family. He filed a police report against him, which is something that I couldn't imagine Mike ever doing, and he was not doing well. And I had to break the bad news to him that since he signed the severance agreement, there wasn't a lot I could do for him. He killed himself the next week. And so when people try to claim that cancel culture doesn't have a human cost, I think of my friend Mike, and he's not the only cost. I know there's more. I know other people who've either been hospitalized or harmed by it or gone through really dark days. Actually, partially because I've been so open about my own mental health struggles. People in the movement always come to me, like when they have trouble. This is a very hard fight, and it takes very brave people, and sometimes we lose some. And what is replacing the attempt to go after professors? There is some sort of superficially good news. The professor cancellations have decreased to some degree, but that's because eventually you run out of witches to burn. Everybody shuts up, everybody conforms, and it just becomes harder to mount these kind of attacks. But guess what else has replaced it? Deplatforming. And by deplatforming, we mean shout downs, disinvitations, all of these things to get speakers off campus. Oftentimes, the only time they're going to hear a dissenting voice is by importing it, and then that doesn't even work out because students will shut it down. Now, 2023 was the worst year for deplatforming we are aware of in history, and this year is going to blow it out of the water. And since October 7th, it's been absolutely out of control. And when it comes to, and FIRE is nonpartisan, we defend people all over the political spectrum. We unapologetically, but when it comes to the shout downs, they have been exclusively from pro-Palestinian students over the past couple months, including a shout down for a professor who was giving a lecture on black holes, which I was like, that sounds awesome. But it was apparently because he's Jewish. And it's like, no anti-Semitism there. So it's been a dark and difficult time. I think everyone knows that there's a problem on campus, except the campuses themselves, and I think the faculty members on campus themselves. We are noticing that maybe sanity is returning, but it's going to take a lot more concentrated effort, a lot more serious reform, a lot more creating alternatives to what higher education, the way it exists today. And I have to, this is a quote from Alan Charles Kors, University of Pennsylvania professor who co-founded FIRE with Harvey Silverglate. I've always loved this quote. And this is my contact information, but I just want to tell you that that group that I talked about, FIRE, is one of the most amazing groups of people you can imagine. We come together from all across the political spectrum, genuinely, to defend freedom of speech cheerfully, with joy on our hearts, even though so many people will hate us for it, depending on the case and depending on the day. And we're doing really innovative work, and we could very much use your support. And this is how you can contact me directly, and I'm very much looking forward to taking your questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. We have quite a number of questions, so we'll go a little rapid fire if you're up for that. This is an interesting one. How much of an influence on public opinion is being swayed in terms of cancer culture by outside actors, China, Russia?
That's an excellent question. So we are sufficiently concerned about China's pernicious role on campus that we actually tasked one of our employees at Fire, Sarah McLaughlin, to take a whole year to work on a book called Authoritarians in the Academy that is primarily about how China directly threatens free speech on college campuses, and about how, if you happen to be a Chinese student studying here and you say anything, about free Taiwan or something like that, they'll go after your family back home. It's really dark and scary stuff. When it comes to the Chinese money that's involved in a lot of this, I do think that I have no problem with there being greater transparency about where people are getting their donations for. I've definitely seen some disturbing data on the influence of Qatar, for example. But I think we too easily assume that this is a problem, paid for by George Soros and hired actors, because it's a little too scary to face. Because it is true, when it came to Columbia, like the people who took over the building in Columbia, about half of those people weren't actually students. So there is reason to be like, oh, these are your outsiders. But to be clear, those aren't actors. Those are activists from off campus. The scarier thing is to understand that a lot of these students are true believers. They believe in an incredibly simplistic way of looking at the world called intersectionality, in which life is simply divided into good people who are oppressed and bad people who oppress them. It is a reductive, silly, anti-intellectual idea, but if you believe it, and you believe it truly, it starts to help you understand everything that's been going on campus for a long time. And it's one of the reasons why DEI offices can't be, just like my co-author Jonathan Haidt says, DEI offices can't be saved. They believe intersectionality to almost a religious degree, and the idea that you could just add Jews to the list of oppressed people won't work, because it goes against the tenets of intersectionality. So that's one of the reasons why, if you see some things that are giving you some hope about changes on campus, we have to go a lot farther than a lot of what's going on right now, because these offices, the DA offices in particular, have been threats to academic freedom and free speech for a long time, and they don't want to go anywhere.
What is the role of social media in the growth of cancel culture?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So in canceling of the American mind, one, I wouldn't quite say criticism that we got of it, but was that we don't spend a lot of time explaining where a lot of this stuff comes from. And that's because that's the entire point of Coddling of the American Mind. Coddling of the American Mind is a book about trying to figure out what was so different about the students hitting campus around 2014. And we talk about 7 different causal factors. But the thing that really made all of this possible, that sped up the depression epidemic and anxiety epidemic, the thing that sped up all of these other bad trends, is social media. And here's why. Social media has lots of pernicious effects. It also has positive effects, to be clear. I'm not a technological alarmist, but I do see genuine problems when you introduce this many additional people into a global conversation. And it just was impossible previously that if you saw a journalist that you really hated, say 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you might write a nasty email or a nasty letter to their editor, and that ends up in a drawer somewhere. Nothing happens. But suddenly, as a generation that had been using cancel culture, I think of it as a technology in grade school, and Ricky's very aware of this. Like, she had cancel culture in grade school because it's very much a middle school girl thing. It's very much a junior high school way of going after people. That what you do is you create the appearance of a flash angry mob that's demanding you fire that person for what they said. And that was not possible before a technology could allow you to create that, oftentimes, illusion. So social media is absolutely part of it. What's the solution to social media? This is where I become a First Amendment lawyer, full on again. I am a little worried about some of our proposed cures for social media. Anything that gives the government too much power should rightfully scare all of you. Anything that requires too much, and anything that requires all citizens to provide ID in order to use social media, you should be plenty scared of. Got no problem with people saying that there shouldn't be social media in school from morning to night. I think that's actually a great solution. But I think that right now we are still in the early days, historically speaking, of dealing with a technology that brought 1 billion additional voices into the global conversation instantaneously. There's never been anything like that in human history. And the idea that this would not be a highly disruptive period, this would not be again, epistemically anarchical period, is foolishness. And we have to culturally adapt to these technological shifts. That's where the real change generally comes from. I mean, when the printing press first came out, it was a vile device. It increased the number of witch trials because the Maleficorum was one of the best sellers of all time. It increased bloody religious strife and civil strife. It had all sorts of negative externalities. And eventually it became a tool for the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, because it put that many people in communication. That possibility seems very far off right now, but I'm afraid that in the horror of what some of the downside of social media, we might actually end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Couple of questions about hate speech, but I'll ask a simplified question. Is hate speech protected speech?
In the United States, absolutely. We have something called the bedrock principle in First Amendment law, which I think is appropriate for every society. I'm the obnoxious, partially because both my parents were foreign. I'm like the obnoxious person who breaks the cardinal rule of being a constitutional lawyer traveling abroad. You're supposed to, when you're in Germany or you're in England or in France, talk about how backwards we are in the United States. Now, you guys get it all right, and that's just our way of doing it over here. We like freedom of speech. You guys don't. That's swell. And I'm the one who goes over it. It's like, you guys have it wrong. We have it right. And one of the things I point out is the bedrock principle. The bedrock principle, it comes out of a 1989 case called Texas v. Johnson. That's the flag burning case. And it says that you cannot ban something simply because people find it offensive. That is the bedrock of the First Amendment. And it's a very sensible rule for a genuinely multicultural society, for a generally diverse society, because I grew up in a neighborhood with a bunch of other immigrant kids. Danny Nguyen's parents, Nelson Bolito's parents, Mikey Barrett's parents, like they all had different ideas. And my British mom, for God's sakes, had very different ideas of like what was impolite, what should get you in trouble, what's sacrilegious, etc. And that changes from year to year, from group to group. It's different between economic classes. It's different between different regions. It's different from year to year, month to month. So it makes sense to not ban things simply because they're offensive. And it makes sense. And one of the reasons why I think that they're doing this, and by the way, you should all know, there is a terrifying law that was likely to be passed in Canada that would literally give you life in prison for speech crimes. And there have been other hate speech laws passed in France and Germany and in England. I mean, we talk about in the book 3,000 people in 2016 going to jail for offensive comments on social media in England, my mother's country. It's very scary out there. So we don't have hate speech as a protected category. The hate speech is protected speech in the United States. It is unprotected in a lot of the rest of the world, and it's a disaster in a lot of the rest of the world.
Comment on the state of Florida's attempt at going into the classroom and making some, we'll just call them legal suggestions in the colleges and universities.
Oh, do you mean the Stop Woke Act?
Yes.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to do that. So this is one of those things where conservatives are supposed to get mad at me because we defeated the Stop Woke Act in court. But I want to explain to you why you shouldn't be mad at me for this. Okay, so the Stop Woke Act literally talked about you can't talk about certain topics in class. Professors can't actually talk categorically about certain topics in class. It was so poorly drafted that it required lawyers to go into court and argue with a straight face somehow that under this law, it's constitutional, but it means that a professor could argue against affirmative action, but they couldn't argue for it. And guess what? You just lost your case right there, buddy. And we were telling them this way before. We tried to intervene at the state level, telling them this is, and I sometimes I think I make my litigators cringe that I use language like this, but whatever, that this is laughably unconstitutional. And we told them this before it passed. We said it after. We said we'd sue because it's unconstitutional. And then, of course, it got laughed out of court. No kidding. It wasn't even close. And here's why you should be angry about the Stop Woke Act. Because higher education reform is important. It needs to happen. And passing something that was unconstitutional and clearly unconstitutional set the movement back tremendously. A lot of these people who are trying to, the same people are saying that cancel culture is a hoax. They fell on that to say, oh, it's the new McCarthyism. There are all these laws being passed across the country saying what you can and can't say in a classroom. And I always point out, actually, there was one, and we defeated it. But it was enough to set back the movement profoundly. So you got to be careful in the way you go about reform. It has to be constitutional. And by the way, if it's not constitutional, FIRE will fight it, no matter what. But this is one of the things when people invite me when they like the fact that we defeated the Stop Woke Act, the thing that I like to pivot to, because like we enjoy being genuinely nonpartisan. Now that we've defeated the Stop Woke Act, the single least constitutional, the single biggest threat to academic freedom in the country is in the state of California, shock, at the community college level. And at this, in this case, this is worse than the Stop Woke Act, and it tells professors that they are required to, they are compelled to, compelled speech. They're compelled to work in concepts of intersectionality, for example, anti-racism, all of these, what Tim Urban calls social justice fundamentalist beliefs into their syllabus and into their classroom. And we launched a lawsuit against this with 6 professors in California. Everyone should know about this lawsuit because I think it's the most important lawsuit we've probably done in our entire existence. And it was nice to get one of them as a chemistry professor. And he made the point, so what is the anti-racist take on the atomic weight of boron? To point out how truly ridiculous this is. So we fight across we fight any threat to the Constitution, but we want to make sure that people know about this lawsuit as well because it's absolutely outrageous.
How can we counteract cancel culture within the legal field, but without fomenting the weaponization of that legal field?
I honestly think a lot of cancel culture is hard to fight legally. Because a lot of what we talk about in cancel culture happens at private institutions. So you actually have to develop a little bit of a better immune system for it. I think some progress has been made. One thing that actually made me happy, I think corporations have a little bit of a better immune system for the ideological contagion, partially because they have to make money. And so there was a case out at Apple where, what is his name again? Martinez, he was a writer, and he wrote a best-selling fiction book that was a little racy, 12 years ago. And but he was also a coder, and he went to work for Apple. And 6 employees or something like that got together, and they formed a cancel mob and said, "This book is offensive. You shouldn't hire that coder," which was very normal, part of cancel culture. And of course, they didn't hire him. Or fired him after he was hired. And I was kind of happy to find out that since then, every single one of the people who tried to cancel him has been fired from Apple. Because when you actually are the people who are preventing corporations from hiring talent, and the best talent, I'm here to tell you, is often weird, eccentric, moody, aspy, all of this stuff, that essentially they're really harming the organization. So I have a little bit of hope there. When it comes to how you fight it in higher ed at the public school level, it's pretty easy. You have a First Amendment to protect it. You bring it to FIRE. We can fight and we can win. At the private school level, you're generally making a contractual argument, saying this school has a promise of academic freedom and free speech, and they should be held to it. And that's why, and I see her in the room tonight, that's why, Penn, that suddenly claimed to be a great defender of freedom of speech, even when it's highly offensive, should immediately be dropping all charges against Amy Wax, because they claim to care about academic freedom and freedom of speech, and they should be held to those promises. But they want their double standards. And that's the thing, is like all of this censorship exists with gross double standards. So there are ways to fight cancel culture, but a lot of it comes down to building a better immune system for it. And I think that corporations deciding that they won't take political positions is a very smart move. It will save you so many headaches. Saying that basically like this is a space where we're a widget factory. Let's remind everybody of that. I think there's ways corporations can find it. And we spend about a third of the book in Canceling the American Mind talking about solutions. And I write more about potential reforms that we could do in higher ed that can make it a better environment for freedom of speech. But it's not a one-shot deal. It's going to require so many different changes, including the fact that one of the problems you see on campuses right now is the application process basically is like, hey, are you an activist? What kind of activist? Are you really, really certain about this thing? Great, we're going to heavily favor you in the application process. And I like activists. I think that they serve a very important role. I'm happy to defend them. But the mentality that you should be looking for in higher ed is you shouldn't be asking them like, what are you really certain about? You should be asking them, when did you change your mind last? When was the last time you sought out someone you disagreed with in order to test your ideas? When was the last time you learned something new? That's the kind of stuff that we should be emphasizing. And we're very happy to help and we are actually working with schools about ways to change the mindset here in a variety of ways, including training programs. But it's going to be a long road.
Tell us about FIRE's rating system for free speech on college university campuses.
I love our rating system.
And
love it.
Where is it free and where is it not? Where's the best and the worst?
Yeah, okay. So I am very proud of the campus free speech ranking at FIRE. I'm a constitutional lawyer, and I kind of pretend to be a social scientist sometimes. I got an intense interest in psychology, and when I wrote Coddling of the American Mind, it was kind of a proof of concept that an interdisciplinary approach to our issues was really powerful. So we ended up getting a research department. Now we have a world-class research department. We got some real all-stars in there, and I couldn't be prouder of them. And over the years, we've been trying to improve our methodology for more accurately conveying what actually the best schools for free speech are. This year, I think we perfected our methodology, or at least came damn close. And what we saw was of the 248 schools that we evaluated, and we only do 248 because frankly it's incredibly expensive. So I'd love to grow that someday. And what we found was that Harvard finished dead last. Not only did they finish dead last, they got a negative 10.69. They got the first negative score in FIRE history because they were so bad on this stuff. And Penn came right behind them. Michigan Technological University came in number one. And I think that's partially because if you look at their breakdown, they have an almost even split between students on different sides of the political fence. I think it's a very healthy epistemic environment. Auburn came in second. University of Virginia did really well. University of Chicago did really well. All of the Ivy League tanked, and deservedly so. Georgetown, terrible. That surprises people sometimes, but it wasn't a surprise to us. We're like, yeah, we've had constant cases at Georgetown. But yeah, Harvard really earned. I have a feeling Penn actually might take over the bottom spot next year because they're not doing great. Harvard's trying to change, which I appreciate. I'm a little skeptical, but I want them to change. And it was funny because initially we got a very Harvard response to them being last, which was essentially, well, Harvard statisticians have looked at this and they think your methodology is bogus, and that some of the professors that we counted against them were not very prominent professors. So you're saying that the professors that you canceled at Harvard don't count because they're not prestigious? Harvard? So Harvard really Harvarded it. They basically are like, I appeal to my own snobbery. And then we could point out, by the way, one of the people who was integral to the process of our ranking is Sam Abrams, a Harvard-educated statistician. And they didn't like that fact. But when they started saying this, I'm like, great. I can go and talk to the media about our methodology, because I can do that all day. And I explained, okay, so our methodology is flawed. Our methodology includes the largest survey of student opinion on freedom of speech ever done. Ever, by a lot. The only ones that compare to the national survey that we do were previous FIRE surveys. So we own that area. And we ask them questions like, is violence acceptable in response to freedom of speech. Oberlin really impressed me on this one. Only about half students said that violence is never acceptable in response to freedom of speech. Only about half, and the rest were kind of like, sometimes it's cool. And that's horrifying. But of course, you get a big minus if you have like half your students saying violence is pretty cool. But we also ask, like, are you afraid to talk to your professors? Are you afraid to talk to your fellow students? Then we have the largest database of professor cancellations, student cancellations, deplatforming, and speech codes ever put together. Like, there's nothing vaguely that compares to it. And when we add all these things together, the Ivy League does terribly. And one of the things that is so powerful about it, and so we're a way of saying, like, we're not completely giving up on higher ed, but if tomorrow, people start saying, I'm not applying to any of these schools in the bottom 10, which included Yale, by the way, deservedly so, that instead I'm sending them to Auburn, which does seem to be happening to a degree, or UVA or something like that, or Michigan Technological University, that can actually use market forces to change. So I'm very proud of the CFSR. It comes out again in September, and I'm kind of dying to see how badly the Ivy League does again.
Follow-up question, then final question.
Yeah.
What else can we do to pressure our alma maters and schools on this issue of free speech on campus?
Excellent question. Well, one, contact us because we've been very effective at this. We have something called Give Half for Liberty for a while there, and what ended up happening is people would send a check to FIRE and say, this is going to you instead of to Penn or Dartmouth, and we write them immediately and say, hey, you lost a donor to us, and they notice that. They notice that pretty well. But alumni and trustees can do a lot more. And one of the things is, don't say, if you don't, I'm giving you my $25,000 donation this year, but if you don't get your act together next year, I won't. No. Say, I'll maybe give a tiny amount, but basically like make them, and make sure that they know that you're doing it because they're not protecting freedom of speech. I think it's really important that that alumni actually, fight hard and make actual consequences for some of these schools until they change. Now, it is true, if you're a donor, you have a better seat at the table, so maybe there is an argument for not going to zero. But I do think that telling them that it's like, hey, I'm sending my kid to Auburn because until you get your freaking act together and I'm not donating again, they notice that stuff. And we have a whole list. We have 10 different recommendations of things that universities can do to change to better respect freedom of speech. I also write a lot of my own about things that could actually help. I think like even things like students going to school later would make a huge difference in a lot of these problems. I also think a lot more jobs not requiring a BA would help a lot with a lot of these problems. But I think there's a tremendous amount alumni can do, and we're happy to work with any and all of you because this has to change.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Greg Lukianoff. Greg, thank you. Thank you.